I will be doing a series of video talks on Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn's August 1914 in anticipation of this year's 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. World War I is the defining event of the 20th century. It brought the crisis of modernity to the masses. It coincided with decisive changes in politics, morals, and literature that have not been reversed, and that have not been necessarily boons for politics, morals, and literature. This work of Solzhenitsyn's, therefore, is important, as it is written by someone very sensitive to the crisis of modernity in all its forms, and who was no unthinking advocate of the old way. If you have to take on faith that Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn is a serious and deep thinker about the ways of modernity, generally, take it on faith and start reading this wonderful and illuminating book. If you have to know first, perhaps this video will help convince you that Solzhenitsyn's work generally is immensely worthy of serious study and reflection. First, a little background on August 1914. It is part of a much, much larger work on Russian history called The Red Wheel, a work that Solzhenitsyn did not finish and that was probably in reality unfinishable. Solzhenitsyn intended The Red Wheel to be a philosophical history of the Russian Revolution to counter two predominant trends in Russian and modern thought. He wanted to show that the victory of the Bolsheviks was not preordained, as per Marxist thought, nor was it something beyond human control, as Tolstoyan fatalists might have thought. The Russian Bolshevik victory happened as the result of human failures of character and calculation. It happened because of choices and accidents. It happened because particular people reacted in specific ways to ideas and events. Solzhenitsyn envisioned the Red Wheel to be about a series of knots, or discrete periods of time between 1914 and 1922, from the outbreak of World War I to the consolidation of Bolshevik control. He envisioned 20 knots, and then he wanted to add additional ones to cover the period till the end of World War II. August 1914, the book, was published separately as the first of these knots on the outbreak of World War I on the eastern side. The outbreak of World War I was the first event that prepared the way for the triumph of the Bolsheviks and that revealed the crisis of modern life. Other books in this series include November 1916 and the remarkable volume called Lenin in Zurich, which takes excerpts from several volumes to paint a picture of Russia's execrable revolutionary. The books on 1917 have not been translated into English yet, and Solzhenitsyn completed only 4 or 5 of these knots. There is a second important thing to recognize about August 1914, and that is that there are 2 distinct editions of the book. The second edition adds important fundamental material to the first edition. The first edition of the book was published in the early 1970s, and it is a work of 64 chapters centering on the Russians' disastrous defeat at the hands of the Germans at Tannenberg. Nearly 100,000 Russians were captured in a great encircling movement by the Germans during this August battle, and this military battle was a portent for more disasters to come, both military and political. The first edition analyzes the military's incompetence and ignorance as it faced the German army, and traces the military's problems to problems endemic to the Tsarist regime itself. For those who want to know about the Eastern Front of World War I, this book is a great place to start. Solzhenitsyn did not erase the first edition when he came out with the second edition in 1984. In this second edition, Solzhenitsyn adds pre-knot knots, or flashbacks, to previous decisive event, and Solzhenitsyn calls these events the Stolypin Cycle. He inserts new chapters, for instance, chapters 8 and 60 through 73, on the statesmanship of Pyotr Stolypin, Russia's prime minister in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1905. Stolypin tried to modernize the Tsarist regime, and partly succeeded, but he was assassinated in 1911 by a double agent of revolutionaries and the Tsarist police. Stolypin's efforts are cataloged especially in the new Chapter 65, a long, dense historical chapter on his life and statescraft. Solzhenitsyn also added chapters on Lenin and the outbreak of the war, which would later be included in Lenin in Zurich. These chapters were necessary parts of the story in Solzhenitsyn's judgment, because he thought it necessary to show that the Tsarist regime was amenable to change and not revolution, and that a prudent statesman, Stolypin, could institute prudent reforms, but these reforms were undone by his assassination. In the second edition, the total number of chapters is 82, up from 64, and the book is lengthened from 622 pages to nearly 900 pages. But the beginning and the end of the two editions are the same. They begin with life on the range and several chapters on what might be called the modern Russian problem. More on this in later videos. And each edition ends with an amazing chapter where the higher-ups in the Russian military analyze the defeat at Tannenberg in a way that exonerates the regime and makes further defeats inevitable. The regime is burying its head in the sand about its own internal defects. That last chapter is worth the price of all the others, as long as one has understood the whole before one gets there. One more introductory thing about August 1914. It is a history and a novel, though I don't know if we should call it a historical novel or a novelistic history. The book defies categorization. It would be best to call it, like Solzhenitsyn's other great work, The Gulag Archipelago, an experiment in literary investigation. It is an attempt to understand the Russian defeat and the decrepitude of the Russian regime in 1914. It uses imagined reflections from actual historical characters such as General Samsonov, the main Russian general of the defeat at Tannenberg, and Stolypin. Samsonov, we see, embodies the virtues and vices of the old imperial Russia. Stolypin understood those virtues and vices and tried to modestly and gradually change the country to mitigate those vices. Some of the novel's characters, especially the central character, Gregor Vortinstev, are fictional. Vortinstev is a capable military man who genuinely wants to save his country and take part in the battle, but who sees the regime-level origins of the disaster that is coming and tries to fix them. But perhaps August 1914, perhaps this book, is much like the work of Thucydides, whose scrupulous historical chronicling is interspersed with the lessons about larger concepts in the form of speeches that he has the historical actors give. Certainly there is nothing in the scope of Solzhenitsyn's ambitions and talents that suggests any inferiority to Thucydides. Now let me make an argument about why those concerned about understanding World War I should turn to this book. World War I was a sign of civilizational sickness. Its mass killing and colossal military incompetence are things to marvel at. This means that the countries that fought in the war were, in some sense, sick, though they may not have known it. The Russian sickness would be a particular variant of that sickness, but it would be a variant of the sickness of English, or the French, or the German, or the Austrians. The Russian sickness led to colossal 20th century plague, the plague of Bolshevik totalitarianism, something that deformed the entire century and that could not help but reveal the problems at the heart of the modern world. The Russian problem was a variant of the modern problem, that is. Certainly, Solzhenitsyn thought the old order was dying, and August 1914 shows why, in some measure, it deserved to die. That is why it is necessary to see this work as part of a larger work, the Red Wheel specifically and Solzhenitsyn's corpus more generally. The question was, what would the principles of the new order be, and whether the new order would be fit for human habitation? Solzhenitsyn's career helps us to think about that question for Russia and for the West generally. No work could be more important.